They were more than machines. They were the answer to the greatest military disaster in aviation history. In June 1941, Germany destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft in a single morning. What followed was one of the most extraordinary rebuilding efforts the world has ever seen. From the ashes of defeat, the Soviet Union forged an air force that eventually dominated the skies of Eastern Europe. Some of these aircraft were built for speed, others for raw firepower. Some survived on numbers alone, while others were engineered to a level of precision that shocked the Luftwaffe. Together, they helped turn the tide of the deadliest air war ever fought. These are every Russian aircraft used in World War II. We begin with the full picture. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Air Force had over 10,000 aircraft and lost most of them in the first weeks. What rebuilt it was not genius alone. It was industrial willpower, brutal simplification, and a willingness to send pilots into combat in machines that were still being perfected. The Il-2 became the most produced military aircraft of all time. The 4 Yak fighter variants together totaled over 36,000 aircraft. These two types alone made up roughly half the Soviet Air Force for most of the war. This is the story of every aircraft that made that possible. Fighter by fighter, bomber by bomber, and roll by roll. Let's start with fighters. Polikarpov I-16. A biplane fighter from the early 1930s, the I-15 was already obsolete by the time Germany invaded. It had fought in the Spanish Civil War, in China, and against Japan and Mongolia. By 1941, it was hopelessly outclassed by everything the Luftwaffe flew, but Soviet pilots flew it anyway because they had no choice. Polikarpov I-16. The I-16 was one of the most advanced fighters in the world when it first appeared, and one of the most dangerous to fly. Fast, stubby, and brutally unforgiving of pilot error, it was the first monoplane fighter with retractable landing gear. By Barbarossa, it was 3 generations behind the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Soviet pilots flew it to their deaths anyway. MiG-3. Built to intercept high-altitude German bombers, the MiG-3 was fast above 5,000 meters and deadly up there. Below that altitude, it was a liability. Difficult to fly and dangerously underpowered in the kind of low-level combat that defined the Eastern Front. Most of the war was fought low. The MiG-3 was in the wrong war, Lend-Lease. Soviet pilots gave it a nickname built from its own initials, Guaranteed Varnished Coffin. Built almost entirely from wood, it was slow, heavy, and outclassed by everything Germany sent against it. Pilots feared it almost as much as the enemy did, but it became the foundation of something far better, Lavochkin La-5. Take the Lag-3 airframe, replace the engine entirely. The result was the La-5, a fighter that could finally meet the Focke-Wulf 190 as an equal. It arrived at Stalingrad. The balance in the air began to shift. For the first time, Soviet pilots had a machine they could believe in. Lavochkin La-7. The La-5 refined to its absolute limit. Lighter, faster, and more lethal. It was arguably the finest Soviet piston fighter of the entire war. In February 1945, Ace Ivan Kozhedub shot down a German Mi-262 jet fighter in an La-7 over the Oder River. The first jet aircraft ever killed by a piston-engine plane in combat, Yakovlev Yak-1. When the Soviet Union needed a modern fighter fast, Yakovlev delivered the Yak-1. Clean, light, and actually survivable to fly, it gave Soviet pilots something they had been denied, a machine that matched the moment. Relatively fast and agile, it could sometimes hold its own against the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Everything that followed was built on this foundation. Yakovlev Yak-3, the lightest fighter of any nation in World War II, and one of the most deadly at low altitude. Pure aggression in a small airframe. In one dogfight on July 16, 1944, 18 Yak-3s faced 24 German fighters. The Soviets lost just 1 aircraft. 15 Germans were shot down. French pilots who flew it in the Normandy Niemen Regiment refused to switch to any other aircraft, including British and American ones. Yakovlev Yak-7. A direct development of the Yak-1, the Yak-7 was converted into a frontline fighter when the crisis of 1941 demanded everything available. Heavier than the Yak-3 but more rugged, it served as a bridge between the early Yak designs and the devastating machines that followed. It was the aircraft of desperation, built fast, used hard, and replaced when something better came. Yakovlev Yak-9. If the Yak-3 was the knife, the Yak-9 was the sword. longer range, more versatile, and produced in 15 different variants. It was the most produced Soviet fighter of the entire war. With 16,769 completed, it came in fighter, fighter bomber, reconnaissance, and special purpose versions. Luftwaffe ace Gerhard Barkhorn flew against every type the Soviets had. He called the Yak-9 the best. Petlyakov P-3. Developed from a dive bomber, which had itself been converted from an interceptor, the P-3 became a multi-role heavy fighter. Only 23 were produced before the German invasion. Then production lines were split, and roughly 300 eventually flew. Unlike almost every other fighter of the war, it had twin engines mounted in the wings. It bristled with cannon and machine guns, and it flew where single-engine fighters feared to go. Now, ground attack aircraft. Ilyushin Il-2 Shturmovik. This is the aircraft that defined Soviet air power in World War II. Joseph Stalin himself called it as necessary to the Red Army as air or bread. Armored, heavily armed, and built to absorb punishment that would destroy any other aircraft, it hunted tanks, shattered convoys, and terrified German ground troops who called it Black Death. With 36,183 units built, it became the most produced military aircraft in the history of aviation. There has never been anything quite like it. Ilyushin Il-10. The Il-2's direct successor, faster, better armed, and more agile. It arrived late in the war but demonstrated exactly where Soviet ground attack doctrine was heading. What the Il-2 had proven through sheer numbers, the Il-10 refined through engineering. It carried the Shturmovik legacy forward into the post-war world. Sukhoi Su-2, a light bomber and close support aircraft designed for fast-moving tactical warfare. It was already being phased out by 1942, but in the opening chaos of Barbarossa, it flew constantly, filling gaps that nothing else could cover. It was the aircraft of crisis, never celebrated, never replaced, simply used until it could no longer be. Next, tactical bombers and dive bombers. Petlyakov P-2. The P-2 was never supposed to be a bomber. It started life as a high-altitude pressurized fighter. 45 days after the redesign order was given, it emerged as a dive bomber, one of the fastest aircraft in the Soviet inventory. 6 P-2s destroyed 250,000 tons of Romanian oil at Ploiești in 1941. Romanian authorities reported it was 100 aircraft. It was 6. Tupolev Tu-2. Fast, well-armed, and easier to fly than the P-2. The Tu-2 was one of the best tactical bombers of the entire war, and one of the least recognized. Production was stopped after only 80 aircraft to prioritize fighters, then restarted in 1943. A Tu-2 could carry 3 times the bomb load of a P-2. A Soviet pilot who flew both called the P-2 absolute rubbish by comparison. The Tu-2 arrived too late to change the war, but it changed everything that came after. Yakovlev, Yak-2, and Yak-4. Light bombers that flew in the desperate early months of the war, the Yak-2 and its improved variant, the Yak-4, were outclassed almost immediately. Used for reconnaissance and light bombing when nothing better was available, which in 1941 was most of the time. They represent the ragged edge of Soviet aviation at its lowest point. Now, strategic bombers. Tupolev TB-3. A relic of the 1930s pressed into a war it was never designed to survive. A massive 4-engine biplane bomber, it had been revolutionary when it first flew in 1930. By 1941, it was a flying target. It flew night missions because daylight meant certain death. It flew them anyway, because someone had to. Ilyushin Il-4. The backbone of Soviet long-range bombing throughout the war. Il-4S of the Soviet Navy conducted the USSR's first bombing raid against Berlin on the night of August 8, 1941. To reach Berlin, they had to reduce their bomb load to make it back. But the message was sent. Over 5,256 examples were built. It flew bombing missions, torpedo strikes, reconnaissance sorties, and transport runs. It did everything asked of it until the war was over. Petlyakov P-8. The only true Soviet strategic heavy bomber of the war, and one of the rarest. It could carry over 11,000 pounds of bombs and strike targets 2,300 miles away. It bombed Berlin beginning in 1941. 4-engine strategic bombers were at odds with Soviet tactical doctrine, and only 93 were ever built. Each one was irreplaceable. Each loss was a strategic wound that could not be healed. Now, Night harassment and light attack. Polikarpov Po-2. No aircraft in this documentary is more improbable. A fabric-covered biplane trainer designed in 1928, it became one of the most effective night attack aircraft of the entire war. It flew so slowly that German fighters stalled trying to shoot it down. Approximately 33,000 were built, making it the second most produced aircraft in history after the IL-2. The most famous Po-2 unit was the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, staffed entirely by women. They flew over 23,000 combat sorties, dropped approximately 3,000 tons of bombs, and 23 of their members received the hero of the Soviet Union. The Germans called them the Night Witches. Now, transport and liaison aircraft. Lisanov Li-2. The Soviet version of the American Douglas DC-3, the Li-2 was the workhorse of Soviet military transport throughout the entire war. It carried troops, supplies, and wounded soldiers. It dropped paratroopers behind German lines and resupplied partisan units operating deep inside occupied territory. Without it, the logistical backbone of the Soviet war effort would have collapsed under its own weight. Now, Lend-Lease aircraft. Bell P-39 Airacobra. America sent thousands of aircraft to the Soviet Union. The P-39 was the one Soviet pilots valued most, not because American pilots rated it highly, but because the Soviets learned to fight with it at low altitude where it was genuinely lethal. Over 5,000 were supplied, with nearly 4,719 reaching Soviet units. Ace Alexander Pokrishkin scored most of his 59 victories in a P-39. He called it the best fighter he ever flew. Bell P-63 King Cobra. The improved successor to the P-39, faster, better armed, and more effective at the altitudes where Soviet pilots preferred to fight. 2,421 were supplied from the United States. American pilots largely dismissed it. Soviet pilots used it to kill Germans. Curtiss P-40 Kitty Hawk. Rugged, reliable, and never spectacular, the P-40 filled critical gaps in Soviet fighter strength during the most dangerous period of the war. 2,425 were delivered. It was not the best fighter anyone flew, but it was available when better aircraft were not. And in 1941 and 1942, available was everything. Supermarine Spitfire. Britain supplied roughly 1,200 Spitfire MiG, IX from 1943 onward. Soviet pilots liked them, but they did not suit Soviet low-altitude tactics or the brutal conditions of forward airfields close to the front. They were assigned to air defense of major cities instead, where their high-altitude performance could be used as intended. They did that job well.